Cerebrella. This is a place for the curious, for the people who hear a familiar word and wonder where it came from, who hold an ordinary object and ask how it got here, who find history not in kings and battles, but in the strange, surprising human stories hiding behind everyday things. Every episode we go deeper into the science, the obsession, the accident, and the genius that shaped the world you live in. So settle in. The story is about to begin. Picture a young man standing at the edge of an oil field in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The year is 1859. The ground beneath his feet has just changed the world. The first commercially successful oil well in American history has been drilled here, and the air smells like sulfur and money and the future. Everyone around him is looking down into the earth, at the black crude oil bubbling up from the ground. They are thinking about kerosene, about lamp fuel, about heat and light, and the fortunes to be made from liquid rock. Robert Augustus Chesebrough is looking at something else entirely. He is looking at the pump rods. Specifically, he is looking at a waxy, slightly translucent substance that keeps building up on the rods and machinery. A residue that the oil workers despise. They call it rod wax. It gums up their equipment. It is to them a nuisance, a byproduct, waste. But the oil workers have also noticed something strange about it. When they get cuts and burns on their hands, and working an oil rig in 1859, they get them constantly. They rub this rod wax onto the wounds, and the wounds, they say, heal faster. Robert Chesebrough heard that, and he did not move on. He stopped. Because Robert Chesebrough was not an oil man. He was a chemist, a 22-year-old chemist from Brooklyn who had traveled to Pennsylvania because his own business, refining kerosene from coal oil, had just been made obsolete by the petroleum boom. He had come to Titusville looking for a new opportunity, expecting to find it in crude oil. He found it instead in the trash. What followed over the next decade was one of the most relentless, single-minded, and frankly strange scientific obsessions in the history of American industry. A story of a man who burned himself, cut himself, abraded his own skin in the name of research, who then drove a horse and buggy across upstate New York, handing out jars of jelly to strangers, who built a company, conquered a continent, and eventually ate a spoonful of his own product every single morning. A man who, in the end, gave the world something so simple, so cheap, and so useful that it sits today in more than 70% of American households, and has been used in various forms for various purposes by everyone from Arctic explorers to Hollywood actresses to the nurses who administered to wounded soldiers in the First World War. This is the story of Vaseline, and it is at its heart the story of a man who looked at waste and saw wonder. The world before Chesebrough. To understand why Vaseline mattered, you have to understand the world it was born into. In 1859, wound care was a grim business. Germ theory, the understanding that microscopic organisms cause infection, was still a radical, contested idea. Louis Pasteur was in the middle of his landmark experiments. Joseph Lister would not publish his work on antiseptic surgery until 1867. In hospitals and homes alike, infected wounds were treated with an assortment of preparations that ranged from mildly helpful to actively dangerous. Turpentine, camphor, mercury compounds, lard, goose fat, poultices made from bread or mud, or chewed plant matter. Skin itself was understood poorly. The concept of a moisture barrier, the skin's role in keeping water in and pathogens out, was not well articulated in medical literature. The idea that you could help a wound heal by protecting it, by creating a physical seal against the environment, was not yet a guiding principle of wound care. For everyday injuries, burns, chapped skin, cracked lips, dry hands, People used whatever they had. Animal fats were the most common skin protectants. Lard, tallow, lanolin from sheep's wool. Beeswax had been used since antiquity. Olive oil, almond oil, and other plant-based oils all had their applications. These worked to varying degrees, but they all had a significant drawback. They went rancid. Animal fat on the skin in warm weather spoiled. The smell was unpleasant. The rancidity itself, the process of oxidation, produced compounds that could irritate the skin rather than protect it. There was also no standard, manufactured product for skin protection available to ordinary people. What you used depended on where you lived, what your family tradition was, what your local apothecary stocked. There was no national brand, no universal solution. The world, in short, was waiting for something stable, something odorless, something that didn't spoil, didn't irritate, didn't smell, and worked. It just didn't know it yet. The oil fields and the discovery. The story of the American oil industry begins, specifically on August 27th, 1859, in Titusville, Pennsylvania, when a former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake struck oil at a depth of 69 feet. Drake's well was not the first oil well in history. There had been oil extraction in Baku, in modern Azerbaijan, for centuries, and in parts of China and Burma for longer. But Drake's well was a commercial breakthrough. It demonstrated that you could drill for petroleum deliberately, reliably, and profitably. Within months, Titusville had been transformed from a quiet lumber town into a boom town. Within years, northwestern Pennsylvania was a forest of derricks. Robert Chesebrough arrived in Titusville in 1859, almost simultaneously with Drake's strike. As a kerosene refiner, Chesebrough already knew how to think about hydrocarbons. He understood the chemistry of distillation, how you could apply heat to a complex mixture and separate it into fractions, each with different properties and uses. He was not intimidated by crude oil. He was curious about it, and when the oil workers pointed him toward the rod wax, the paraffin-like residue building up on the pump equipment, his chemist's brain immediately started asking questions. What was this substance? Where did it come from in the crude oil? What were its properties? And most importantly, why did these roughnecks, men who were famously skeptical of anything resembling medical advice, trust it on their wounds? Chesebrough gathered samples of rod wax and took them back to Brooklyn. What followed was 11 years of work. 11 years. It's worth sitting with that number. In an era obsessed with speed and fortune and get-rich-quick schemes, in the middle of a literal oil rush where men were making and losing fortunes in months, Robert Chesebrough spent 11 years in a laboratory, quietly working on a derivative of waste product. His process was essentially one of purification. Crude rod wax was a complex mixture of hydrocarbons, some of which were useful, many of which were not. Chesebrough developed methods to distill and filter this wax through a series of steps, removing the darker, heavier compounds, stripping out the impurities, refining what remained into something increasingly pure, increasingly pale, increasingly stable. What he was working toward, though he didn't have this vocabulary, was petroleum, a semi-solid mixture of hydrocarbons derived from petroleum, with a melting point close to body temperature, chemically inert, odorless, and extraordinarily stable. It would not oxidize, it would not go rancid, it would not react with the skin or with other compounds. It was, in chemical terms, beautifully boring, and that boringness was precisely its genius. But Chesebrough did not just work with chemicals, he worked with himself. This is the part of the story that most people find either inspiring or alarming, depending on their disposition. To test his preparations, to understand how they behaved on damaged skin, Chesebrough deliberately injured himself. He burned his hands and arms. He made cuts and scrapes and abrasions, and then he applied his various preparations to some wounds and left others untreated, observing the results systematically over time. He kept notes, he adjusted his formula, he injured himself again. By any modern standard of research ethics, this was extraordinary. It was also, in the context of mid-19th century science, not entirely unusual. Self-experimentation was a recognized, if extreme, form of scientific inquiry. Researchers throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries would ingest suspicious compounds, infect themselves with diseases, and subject themselves to various physical interventions in the name of data. What set Chesebrough apart was the duration and dedication of his self-testing. This was not a one-time dramatic gesture. It was a sustained research practice across years. By approximately 1870, he had a product he was satisfied with. He called it Vaseline. The etymology of the name is somewhat debated, but the most widely accepted account is that Chesebrough coined it from the German word Wasser, meaning water, and the Greek word eleon, meaning olive oil. Water plus oil, a name that gestured at the product's role as a skin protectant and moisturizer. Even if chemically speaking, petroleum jelly has nothing to do with either water or olive oil. He had his product. Now he needed to sell it. The horse-and-buggy campaign. Robert Chesebrough did not have venture capital. He did not have an advertising agency. He did not have a network of distributors or a factory at scale. What he had was a horse, a buggy, and absolute unshakable conviction in his product. Beginning in 1870, Chesebrough embarked on one of the most unusual marketing campaigns in American commercial history. He loaded his buggy with small sample jars of Vaseline and drove, town by town, through upstate New York. At each stop, he did not simply hand out samples and leave. He performed. He would gather a small crowd and in front of them burn his skin or cut his hand, and then apply Vaseline to the wound. He would show them previous wounds at various stages of healing. He would pass around jars for people to touch, smell, examine. He was his own demonstration, his own testimonial, his own clinical trial. It was part medicine show, part scientific lecture, part sheer audacity. And it worked. People were skeptical at first. Frontier-era Americans had seen enough snake oil to be cautious about any man claiming his product healed wounds. But Chesebrough had several things going for him. First, Vaseline was free, at least initially. He gave it away. There was no financial risk for a skeptical farmer or shopkeeper to try it. Second, the product's simplicity was disarming. It didn't smell like anything suspicious. It wasn't brightly colored. It wasn't accompanied by wild claims about curing diseases. It was a pale, slightly translucent jelly that Chesebrough claimed simply protected skin and helped it heal. That modesty built trust. Third, and most importantly, it worked. People tried it on burns and cuts and chapped hands and dry skin, and they found that it did what Chesebrough said it would do. Word spread in the way that genuinely useful things always spread, one person telling another. By 1872, Chesebrough had incorporated the Chesebrough Manufacturing Company. By 1874, he had a factory in Brooklyn and was producing and selling Vaseline commercially at scale. The growth was remarkable. Within a few years of commercial launch, Chesebrough claimed that Americans were buying a jar of Vaseline every minute. Whether that number was precise or part of his flair for showmanship, the underlying reality was clear. Vaseline was a phenomenon. Druggists stocked it, households kept it, doctors began recommending it. The product had accomplished what almost no consumer product manages to do in its own time. It became, almost immediately, indispensable. Chesebrough's success attracted the attention of Standard Oil, John the 500th, Rockefeller's petroleum empire, which had been methodically consolidating control over every aspect of the American oil industry. In 1881, Standard Oil acquired the Chesebrough Manufacturing Company. Chesebrough stayed on to run it, and his product, now backed by the distribution muscle of the most powerful corporation in America, went global. Vaseline goes to the world. The last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th were Vaseline's age of expansion. The product moved across the United States, into Canada, into Europe, into the far corners of the British Empire. It arrived in places where conventional medicine was scarce and proved, in those contexts, even more valuable than in well-supplied cities. In 1881, when Chesebrough himself travelled to England, he reportedly visited Queen Victoria and gave her a jar of Vaseline. Whether the Queen actually used it or simply received it graciously is lost to history, but the story, real or embellished, was the kind of royal endorsement that money could not buy. Meanwhile, actual medical and practical endorsements were accumulating rapidly. Arctic and Antarctic explorers discovered that Vaseline was one of the most effective protectants against the brutal combination of cold, wind, and dry air that cracked and destroyed exposed skin. Robert Peary's expeditions to the North Pole carried it. Later, Ernest Shackleton's men in Antarctica used it. In environments where skin damage could become a life-threatening issue, where a cracked, infected wound could mean the difference between continuing or turning back, a stable, non-freezing, reliably protective barrier substance was genuinely valuable. The military uses of Vaseline accumulated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the First World War, it was used by medical corps on both sides as a wound dressing component, as a lubricant for equipment, and as protection against the maddening combination of trench conditions, wet, cold, abrasive, that produced a condition called trench foot, a deterioration of the skin and underlying tissue from prolonged moisture exposure. It was used on the faces of pilots in open cockpit aircraft to protect against windburn and cold at altitude. It was used by telegraphers to protect the contacts and connections of their equipment from moisture and corrosion, because petroleum, being chemically inert and water-resistant, is an excellent protector of metal as well as skin. By the early 20th century, Vaseline had become something unusual in commercial history, a product that had found genuine, independent uses in medicine, industry, exploration, and personal care simultaneously. Its applications had not been invented by marketers, they had been discovered, spontaneously, organically, by people who found that its properties solved real problems. Doctors used it as a base for medicated ointments and salves. Its inertness meant it wouldn't react with active drug compounds. Its consistency made it easy to apply and keep in place on skin. Dermatologists found it effective in the treatment of dry skin conditions, eczema, and minor burns, not because it had any active healing compound, but because it created an occlusive barrier that reduced water loss from the skin and created the moist environment in which tissue repair proceeds most efficiently. This mechanism was not understood in Chesebrough's time, but it is now well established in the dermatological literature and remains the primary scientific explanation for why petroleum jelly helps wounds heal. Chesebrough himself remained, throughout this period, an enthusiast of his own product in ways that went beyond reasonable commercial advocacy. He maintained until late in life that he ate a spoonful of Vaseline every single morning. He claimed it was good for the digestion. Whether this is true, and whether it actually did anything at all, is genuinely unclear. Petroleum jelly passes through the digestive system essentially unchanged. It is not absorbed and has no known nutritional or pharmacological effect when ingested in small amounts. It is also not acutely harmful in those quantities. So Chesebrough's morning spoonful was probably neither helping nor hurting him, but it was remarkable as a statement of personal conviction. Here was a man who believed so deeply in what he had made that he ate it every day For decades, he lived to be 96 years old. Draw from that what conclusions you will. The science of why it works. Let us step back from the story for a moment and into the laboratory. Because understanding why Vaseline works is in some ways as interesting as the history of how it was discovered. Petroleum jelly, petroleum, is a mixture of hydrocarbons, the same class of carbon and hydrogen compounds that make up crude oil, natural gas, and most plastics. The specific hydrocarbons in petroleum are long-chain molecules in the paraffin family, solid or semi-solid at room temperature, but soft enough at body temperature to spread easily on skin. What makes petroleum chemically special is its stability. Unlike fats and oils, which contain carbon double bonds that can react with oxygen, the process of going rancid, petroleum is almost entirely saturated, meaning those reactive sites are filled. It doesn't oxidize, it doesn't break down. Left in a sealed container in normal conditions, it will remain chemically identical, essentially indefinitely. On skin, this stability translates into something dermatologists call an occlusive effect. When you apply petroleum jelly to skin, it forms a physical barrier, a thin film that dramatically slows the evaporation of water through the outer skin layers. This matters enormously for healing. Damaged skin, burned, cut, chapped, or otherwise compromised, loses water much faster than intact skin. That water loss dries out the wound environment, impedes cell migration, and slows the entire repair process. By holding moisture in, an occlusive barrier like petroleum keeps the wound bed moist and allows skin cells to move and multiply more efficiently. This is not Chesebrough's theory. He didn't know any of this. He observed empirically that wounds treated with his preparation healed faster. And he was right, for reasons he could not have articulated. Modern dermatology has in many ways come back around to petroleum jelly after decades of more elaborate alternatives. In the 1980s and 90s, the personal care industry developed an enormous range of sophisticated moisturizers, products with complex ingredient lists, active compounds, peptides, ceramides, hyaluronic acid, retinoids. Many of these are genuinely effective, some are not. The marketing complexity around moisturizers became at times bewildering. Meanwhile, a quiet body of dermatological research kept finding that for basic skin barrier protection and wound care, simple petroleum was remarkably difficult to beat. A 2016 study published in JAMA Dermatology found that petroleum jelly was as effective as prescription antibiotic ointments in preventing surgical wound infections, and cheaper with a better side effect profile. Dermatologists sometimes call it slugging, the practice of applying a thin layer of petroleum jelly to the face before sleep, as the final step of a skincare routine. It went viral on social media in the early 2020s as a skincare hack. It is, in essence, exactly what Robert Chesebrough was advocating in 1870. Some things, it turns out, are not improved by being replaced. Chesebrough's legacy and the modern Vaseline. Robert Chesebrough died in 1933 at the age of 96. His company, the Chesebrough Manufacturing Company, had by then been part of Standard Oil's successor companies for decades. In 1955, it merged with Pond's, the cold cream company, to form Chesebrough Pond's. In 1987, Chesebrough Pond's was acquired by Unilever, the Anglo-Dutch consumer goods giant that today owns an extraordinary range of household brands worldwide. Vaseline under Unilever became a genuinely global brand, one of the most recognized in the world across an enormous range of demographics and geographies. In developing markets, Vaseline's penetration is particularly remarkable. In sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, In parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia, the blue-capped yellow jar of Vaseline is often one of the most widely distributed personal care products available. It is used for skin care, for baby care, for lip protection, for hair, particularly as a scalp moisturizer in communities with hair care traditions that differ from the Western norm. In many of these markets, Unilever has extended the Vaseline brand into lotion and body care products, specifically formulated for darker skin tones and for the particular moisture needs of skin in tropical and arid climates. The Vaseline Intensive Care line, for example, was reformulated after research into how skin in different climates and with different melanin levels responds differently to moisturizers. The original product, the plain petroleum jelly in the iconic jar, has remained essentially unchanged since Chesebrough finalized his formula in the 1870s. Think about that for a moment. In an industry that reinvents itself constantly, that launches new products and new formulas and new ingredient combinations every year, the flagship product of one of the world's largest personal care brands is a substance that has not been meaningfully reformulated in 150 years. Because it doesn't need to be, the uses people have found for it have continued to multiply. A partial list of documented applications of petroleum jelly includes wound care, lip protection, prevention of diaper rash, removal of makeup, treatment of dry skin and eczema, lubrication of stuck zippers and door hinges, protection of car battery terminals from corrosion, prevention of paint from adhering to surfaces during home improvement, conditioning of leather goods, protection of skin during hair dyeing, soothing of irritated nostrils during illness, and, in a use that would have delighted Chesebrough, application to the feet of marathon runners to prevent blisters. It has been rubbed onto the faces of boxers before fights to help punches glide off rather than cut. It has been used by channel swimmers to protect against cold water. It has been packed in emergency medical kits, military first aid kits, and the personal bags of nurses and paramedics who have learnt through experience that sometimes the oldest solution is also the most reliable one. There is a particular kind of genius that the history of invention tends to undervalue. We celebrate the inventors of dramatic, visible, world-reordering technologies. The steam engine, the telephone, the computer chip. We tell the stories of transformation and disruption and paradigm shifts. But there is another kind of genius, quieter, more patient, that belongs to people like Robert Chesebrough. He did not invent anything that had not existed before. The hydrocarbons in Vaseline were already present in the earth, already surfacing in the waste of the oil fields, already being rubbed onto cracked hands by roughnecks who knew from simple experience that it helped. What Chesebrough did was pay attention. He looked at something everyone else called waste and asked, what is this, actually? What does it do? How does it do it? And how do I make it available to everyone? And then he spent 11 years answering those questions, systematically, obsessively, on his own skin. The horse-and-buggy drives through upstate New York. The self-inflicted burns and cuts. The morning spoonfuls of jelly taken every day for decades. These are not the behaviors of a typical entrepreneur. They are the behaviors of a man in the grip of a genuine conviction, sustained by evidence he had personally, painfully collected. He was right. Today, more than 1 billion people use products descended from that rod wax scraped off Pennsylvania oil field equipment in 1859. The jar in your medicine cabinet, the lip balm in your pocket, the ointment on a child's scraped knee, all of it traces back to a young chemist standing in a muddy field, watching everyone else look for gold in the ground, while he looked at the grime on the machinery and saw something else entirely. He saw wonder in waste. He saw in something everyone else discarded, something that could help, something simple, something stable, Something that the body, human skin, the largest organ we possess, the boundary between ourselves and the world, would accept and work with rather than fight against. Robert Chesebrough never struck oil. He found something far more durable. This has been Black Gold to Wonder Jelly, the extraordinary story of Vaseline and the man who ate it. Thanks for listening.